Every year, on the same day, a small brown envelope came to Rosa's bakery in Santa Fe. Inside was cash, exact to the dollar, and a short note typed on plain paper. The note never changed. It said, "1 vanilla cake, 3 layers, no name on top, deliver to the usual address." Rosa Delgado had been receiving this order for 32 years. She was 58 years old now, and her hands had flour worked so deep into the lines of her palms that no amount of washing could take it out. She ran a small bakery on a quiet street a few blocks from the plaza, the kind of place with a bell on the door and a cat that slept in the window during the day. The paint on the sign outside had faded from bright red to a soft rust color, and the wooden floor inside creaked in the same 3 places it always had. But people still came, morning after morning, for her bread and her cinnamon rolls and the smell that drifted out onto the sidewalk before the sun was even fully up. She never asked who the cake was for. In the beginning, many years ago, she had tried. She had written a note back once, tucked inside the box before it left her hands, asking for a name, asking for anything at all. No answer ever came. The next year, the order arrived exactly the same as always, as if her note had simply been thrown away without being read. So she stopped asking. She simply baked the cake, wrapped it in the same white box tied with plain string, and left it at the same drop point. A small courier service 2 streets over that took it from there. She never saw who picked it up. She never saw where it went. For 32 years, that cake had traveled somewhere far beyond her sight, and she had made her peace with never knowing. If you asked her why she still did it, after all these years, long after she no longer needed the money the way she once had, she would shrug and say it was tradition now, nothing more. But if you looked closer, if you watched her hands while she worked, you would see something else. Every year, on that same day, when she cracked the eggs for that particular cake, her hands would go still for a moment over the bowl, as if she were listening for something. As if some part of her, some part she never let herself examine too closely, was still waiting for an answer that had never come. 2,000 miles away in Los Angeles, a man named Adam Whitfield was turning 32. He did not know about the cake's true origin. He did not know about Rosa at all. He knew only that every year, on his birthday, a vanilla cake appeared on the kitchen counter of his father's house, already cut into neat slices, already served on the good china, with no card and no explanation attached. When he was young, he used to ask about it. His father always said the same thing in the same easy tone. "A family friend sends it every year. Don't worry about who. Just enjoy it." Adam had stopped asking a long time ago. Children learn quickly which questions their parents do not want to answer, and by the time he was a teenager, the cake had simply become part of the background of his life. One small, unexplained thread among many in a family that valued appearances over explanations. He was a defense attorney now, sharp and respected, the kind of lawyer who worked long nights and rarely lost a case he believed in. His office on the 14th floor of a downtown building looked out over the city, and his name was on the door in gold letters, right below the name of the firm. His father's connections had helped him join straight out of law school. He had built his career the way he built everything else in his life, carefully, methodically, without looking back at anything that might slow him down. He had been adopted as an infant by Richard and Eleanor Whitfield, a wealthy couple from Los Angeles. He grew up believing a story that had been told to him so many times over the years that it felt less like a memory and more like fact carved into stone. His birth mother, they said, had been young and poor, and had chosen to give him up because she wanted him to have a better life than she could ever provide. Chosen. That word had followed him his whole life, sitting quietly behind every success he ever achieved, every case he ever won. She chose money over him. She chose an easier life without the burden of a child. He never spoke about it out loud, not even to the few people close enough to know he was adopted, but it lived in him anyway. a small cold stone he carried without ever quite naming it. He never blamed her exactly, not in words, but he never forgave her either. It is hard to forgive someone you believe walked away on purpose, even when you have never once heard her side of the story. What Adam did not know, what he could not possibly have known, was that the woman who baked his birthday cake every single year, with the same careful hands and the same quiet pause over the mixing bowl, was the same woman who had been told, more than 3 decades earlier, that giving him up was the only way to protect everyone she loved, including him. Rosa's morning routine had not changed in decades. She woke before dawn, before the sky outside her small apartment above the bakery had even begun to turn gray, and walked down the narrow back stairs into the kitchen that smelled permanently of yeast and cinnamon and butter. She turned on the ovens first, then measured flour into the big steel bowl her mother had given her when she first came to the United States, worn smooth now from thousands of mornings just like this one. She had done this every single day for over 30 years, through good years and hard ones, through the slow seasons when tourists stopped coming and the busy ones when the line stretched out the door before she had even unlocked it. She had come to New Mexico from a small town in Mexico when she was 19, following an older cousin who promised there was steady work in the hotel kitchens of Santa Fe. She had grown up in her family's small restaurant, learning to bake bread and pastries at her mother's side before she was tall enough to reach the counter without a stool. Baking was the one thing in her life that had never once let her down, the one skill that stayed with her no matter what else changed, no matter what else was taken from her along the way. She thought about her son sometimes in the quiet hours before the bakery opened. Not often, not in a way she allowed herself to dwell on, because dwelling on it had nearly broken her once, many years ago, in the months right after she signed the papers. She had told herself over and over that thinking about him only made the ache worse, and that the kindest thing she could do for both of them was to let the wondering go. But some part of her had never quite managed it. Some part of her still counted the years in her head without meaning to, still wondered, quietly, what he looked like now. What kind of man he had grown into, whether he was happy, whether anyone had ever told him the truth. The call came into Adam's office on a Tuesday morning, early enough that the coffee in his cup was still too hot to drink. It was from a public defender named Carla Jimenez, someone he had known since law school, back when they were both idealistic students who believed the law could actually fix things. She sounded tired in the way that only overworked public defenders ever sound. "I need a favor," she said. "A small one. There's a woman in Santa Fe, an old baker, arrested for theft. Flour, sugar, a used mixer taken from a restaurant supply warehouse after hours. It should be nothing. A fine and a stern talking to. But somebody wants to make an example of her, and I don't have the hours to give it the attention it needs. I thought of you." Adam almost said no. He had real cases on his desk, cases with money behind them and stakes that mattered to his career. A pro bono theft case in another state was not the kind of thing that built a law practice. But something about the way Carla described it stuck with him. The charges were too aggressive for what amounted to a struggling small business owner trying to keep her shop open. Someone, somewhere, wanted this case to be bigger than it should have been, and that kind of imbalance always caught Adam's attention. More than anything else in his career, he hated watching the system get used as a weapon against people who had no way to fight back. He agreed to take the case and flew to Santa Fe 2 days later, telling himself it would be a quick trip, a few days at most, enough time to get the charges reduced or dismissed and get back to his real life in Los Angeles. Rosa Delgado sat across from him in a small meeting room at the courthouse, her hands folded on the table in front of her, her eyes tired but steady in a way that told him she had already decided not to let this break her, no matter how it ended. She did not look like a criminal. She looked like someone who had been fighting a long, quiet war for years and was simply worn down from carrying it alone for so long. "I did not steal to get rich," she told him, her voice calm and plain. "I stole because my bakery was going to close, and if my bakery closes, I have nothing left. 30 years of my life gone because I could not afford a new mixer after mine finally broke for good." Adam believed her almost immediately. It was not just her words. It was the way she spoke, careful and unhurried, like someone who had learned a long time ago not to waste breath on things that did not matter, and to save every ounce of energy for the things that did. As he began digging into the case over the following days, reviewing the paperwork Carla had gathered and requesting more of his own, he found something that did not sit right. The original complaint against Rosa had been filed by a company that supplied the warehouse she had taken the items from, a company called Sundance Restaurant Supply. But Sundance was not simply a local business acting on its own. When Adam traced its ownership through several layers of holding companies, a process that took him most of one long night at his hotel, he found that it was owned, several steps removed, by an investment group based in Los Angeles. He recognized the name of that investment group immediately because it was the company his own father had built from nothing over 4 decades, Whitfield Capital Partners. Adam remembered being a boy of maybe 8 years old, sitting at the long dining table in the Whitfield house, watching his mother, Eleanor, cut the birthday cake into careful, even slices, while his father stood by the window with a drink in his hand, watching the whole scene with an expression Adam had never been able to read as a child. He remembered asking, in the plain and direct way children ask difficult questions without knowing they are difficult, why nobody ever signed the card, if there even was a card at all. His father had laughed it off, ruffled his hair, and changed the subject to something else entirely, and young Adam had learned the way children learn most things, simply by watching what made the adults around him uncomfortable, that this was not a question to keep asking. By the time he was a teenager, he had built a quiet story in his own mind to explain the parts of his life that never quite added up, the vague answers about his birth mother, the cake that arrived every year like clockwork from no one in particular. He decided, somewhere around 15 or 16, that thinking too hard about any of it only led to disappointment, and that the life he had, however strange its edges, was still a good one. He focused instead on school, then on law school, then on building a career that left him little time to sit with old questions he had long ago decided not to ask out loud. Richard Whitfield was not a cruel man on the surface, not in any way most people would recognize. He was the kind of man people described as generous, a man who gave large sums to hospitals and universities, whose name was etched on plaques in 3 different cities. He had raised Adam with every advantage money could buy: private schools with manicured lawns, summers in Europe, a law degree paid for in full without a single loan attached. He had told Adam 1,000 times over the years how proud he was of him, how far he had come, how much he had accomplished. What Richard Whitfield had never told Adam, not once in 32 years, was the truth about where his son actually came from. 33 years earlier, Richard had been a younger man, ambitious and already married to Eleanor, though their marriage had always been more of a careful business arrangement than a love story, one that kept both of their families' fortunes safely intact and their social standing secure. During a business trip to Santa Fe to look at a hotel property his company was considering acquiring, he had met a young woman named Rosa, 25 years old at the time, working as a pastry assistant in the hotel's restaurant kitchen. What began as something Richard told himself was harmless, a brief distraction during a long trip away from home, turned into an affair that lasted several months, carried out in quiet visits and careful secrecy whenever his work brought him back to the city. When Rosa found out she was pregnant, Richard panicked in a way he had never panicked about anything before. A child born from that relationship threatened everything he had built: his marriage, his standing among people whose opinions mattered to him, the careful image of a devoted family man he had spent years constructing. He came to Rosa not with kindness or concern for her, but with pressure, cold and calculated. He told her plainly that if she kept the child and ever tried to make any claim on him, he had the money and the lawyers to ruin a young woman with no family influence and no power behind her, and he made certain she understood that threat clearly, without any room for misunderstanding. In a colder moment, one she never fully described to anyone in the years that followed, he also threatened to have her family's small restaurant business back in Mexico investigated and shut down through connections he had. Unless she agreed to give the child up quietly through a private adoption, he would arrange himself, on his own terms, with his own lawyers handling every detail. Rosa was alone in a foreign country, frightened and completely outmatched by a man with more money and more power than she could ever hope to challenge. After weeks of sleepless nights, she agreed, believing it was the only way to protect her family and give her child any chance at a safe life. The adoption was arranged through private channels, paid for entirely by Richard, hidden behind enough layers of paperwork and legal language that no one would ever easily connect the child to him. Richard and his wife Eleanor, who could not have children of their own after years of trying, adopted the baby as their own son, presenting the story to their families and their social circle as a blessing that had finally come after a long and difficult search. Eleanor never knew the boy was actually her husband's biological child. She believed, exactly as she had been told, that the adoption came through a reputable agency with no personal connection to anyone they knew, and she loved the boy with a fierce and genuine devotion that never once wavered, even as the truth sat hidden just beneath the surface of her entire family life. Richard felt guilt, in his own way, for the rest of his life. But guilt in a man like Richard did not turn into honesty. It turned into control. He could not undo what he had done, so instead he tried to manage it quietly from a distance, the same way he managed every uncomfortable problem in his life, through careful arrangements and money moved in ways that left no obvious trail. Every year on the boy's birthday, he arranged for a cake to be ordered from a small bakery in Santa Fe, the same bakery where Rosa had eventually opened her own shop after years of working long hours for other people. He told himself it was harmless, a small, quiet tribute that hurt no one, money moving in a circle no one would ever trace back to its true purpose. In truth, it was hush money disguised as tradition, a way of paying Rosa year after year to stay silent and stay away, and a way of quietly checking, from a safe distance, that she was still there, still baking, still keeping her end of a bargain she had never truly agreed to in the first place, only surrendered to out of fear. Rosa never fully understood why the anonymous order kept coming, year after year, decade after decade. She only knew it was steady, reliable income from a client who never asked for anything beyond the cake itself, and in the hardest years of running her small business, that income had helped keep her doors open when nothing else could. She had no idea, not for one single moment across 3 decades, that the cake she baked every year was traveling straight to her own son. As Rosa's bakery slowly grew, quietly successful, but never wealthy, always just one bad month away from real trouble, Richard began to see her less as a settled matter from his past and more as an ongoing risk that never fully went away. What if she ever talked to someone? What if she ever came looking for the boy, now a grown man with a respected name and a career that could be damaged by scandal? Over the years, through people who worked for him and had learned long ago not to ask too many questions about the reasons behind his instructions, he made her life harder in small, deniable ways that never traced back to him directly. A permit that took far longer than it should have. A supplier who suddenly raised prices only for her shop and no one else on the block. A landlord who was quietly convinced, through channels Rosa never saw, to raise her rent well beyond what the market called for. Nothing that could ever be proven or connected to a single source. Just enough steady pressure to keep her small, keep her struggling, keep her too busy simply surviving to ever look up and start asking dangerous questions about where the trouble was really coming from. The warehouse theft case that eventually landed on Adam's desk was the final piece of that same long pattern, though this time it went further than Richard had originally intended it to go. A warehouse manager who worked for one of Richard's companies decided, entirely on his own initiative, to make an example of Rosa when he caught her taking a small amount of supplies after hours, not realizing the personal history behind why his company had been quietly hostile toward her business for years, without any clear explanation given to him. He pushed for the harshest possible charges available, hoping to impress the people above him with his diligence. Richard, when word of the arrest eventually reached him through routine business reports, did not step in to stop it. Some old, cold part of him, tired after decades of carrying a secret he could never fully put down, told himself that a harsher lesson this time might finally make her disappear from the edges of his life for good. He never once imagined, in his worst calculations, that his own son would be the one to walk into a Santa Fe courtroom and defend her. Adam worked the case the way he worked every case that mattered to him, methodically, chasing every document, every signature, every date, refusing to let a single loose thread go unexamined. He requested the original adoption records as part of a broader effort to understand any possible connection between the supply company and Rosa's history, thinking at first it might simply help explain the pattern of quiet harassment he had already started to suspect. He did not expect what he actually found waiting inside those old files. Late one night in his hotel room in Santa Fe, surrounded by case files spread across the bed and the small desk by the window, he opened a set of old private adoption documents that had been quietly included in a broader records request from a state archive, buried among dozens of unrelated papers no one had thought to review closely. The papers were faded, the ink slightly smudged in places from decades of storage, but the names were still clear enough to read. A birth date, a birth mother's name, written plainly across the top of the page, Rosa Delgado. An adopting family listed only by an attorney's name at first glance, but cross-referenced 2 pages later, through a filing fee record buried near the back of the folder, to Richard and Eleanor Whitfield. Adam sat completely still for a long time after that, the papers trembling slightly in his hands, though the room around him was perfectly still and quiet. He read the page again, and then again, certain he must be misreading something, certain there had to be another explanation, a coincidence, a common name shared by 2 different families entirely, anything other than the truth sitting plainly in front of him in black ink on old paper. But the birth date matched his own exactly, down to the day. The state and city matched the vague story he had always been told about where he was born, and the more he searched that night, cross-referencing old business travel records he found buried in his father's company archives, records he had originally pulled months earlier for an entirely unrelated matter and never had reason to look at closely until now, the clearer and more undeniable the timeline became. His father had been in Santa Fe 9 months before Adam was born, on a business trip that lasted far longer than the property acquisition it was officially attached to could reasonably explain. He got up from the small desk and walked to the window, looking out over the dark rooftops of a city he had only known for a few weeks. A city that had apparently shaped the entire hidden truth of his existence long before he ever set foot in it as a grown man. He thought about calling someone, his mother, a friend, anyone who might tell him he was wrong, that he had simply misread an old and unrelated document in the middle of a stressful case. But he already knew, with the same certainty he felt when a jury's verdict was about to go his way, that he was not wrong. He spent the rest of that night building the case the way he built every case, laying the documents out in careful order across the hotel bed, cross-checking dates against dates, names against names, until the pattern was undeniable even to the most skeptical version of himself. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, exhausted and hollowed out in a way no amount of coffee could fix, he finally allowed himself to stop working and simply sit with what he now knew. He thought about the cake that appeared every year on his birthday. He thought about the woman sitting in a courthouse holding room 2 days earlier, telling him plainly that she had nothing left to lose. He thought about 32 years of a story he had never once questioned, a story that had just quietly fallen apart in front of him at 4 in the morning in a hotel room 500 miles from home. The truth did not arrive for Adam as a warm, emotional revelation, the kind of moment people imagine when they picture finding a lost parent. It arrived as a legal document, cold and precise, the same way 100 other case-breaking discoveries had arrived on 100 other long nights throughout his career. That was, in its own strange way, the cruelest part of it. He had spent his entire career finding the truth for other people, uncovering exactly this kind of buried fact to help his clients. Now the truth had found him instead, hiding in a filing cabinet, sitting in plain sight the entire time, waiting patiently for someone to finally open the right folder. Adam did not tell Rosa what he had found right away. He needed time to be sure, to check and recheck every detail until there was no room left for doubt, and more than that, he needed time to figure out what any of it actually meant, both for the case and for the rest of his life. He kept working as her attorney in the days that followed, showing up each morning with the same calm focus he always brought to his work, though something in him had shifted permanently and would never fully settle back into place. He started noticing things about Rosa that he had been too focused on the legal details to notice before. The way she moved through her small kitchen in the back of the bakery, efficient and sure despite everything hanging over her future. The way she always saved the first slice of any fresh cake for whichever child happened to be lingering outside her shop window that day, even on days when she could not really afford to give food away for free. The way her eyes, when she thought no one was paying attention, would sometimes drift toward a small framed photo she kept near the old register, a photo no customer had ever asked her about in all the years it had sat there. One evening, after a long day spent preparing for the upcoming hearing, Adam finally asked her about the anonymous birthday cake order, the one she had baked every single year for more than 3 decades without fail. He framed the question carefully, as if it were simply part of understanding her business records for the case, part of building a complete financial picture to present to the judge. But his voice was not as steady as he wanted it to be, and Rosa, who had spent a lifetime learning to read people carefully in order to survive, noticed immediately that something more was happening beneath his words. "Why does that particular order matter to my case?" she asked him quietly, watching his face. Adam did not answer right away. Instead, he reached into his bag and set an old photograph on the table between them, one he had found tucked among his father's private business files during a late-night search. He had not fully explained even to himself. A photograph of a young woman standing in a hotel kitchen in Santa Fe, laughing at something happening just outside the frame of the picture. Rosa looked down at the photograph, and all the color drained slowly from her face. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Adam told her everything then, sitting across the small table in her quiet kitchen after closing hours, the smell of that day's bread still hanging faintly in the air around them. The adoption papers, the exact matching birth date, the travel records, his father's name listed plainly on the original filing fee document. He watched her face carefully as he spoke, watched 3 decades of quiet, carried grief rise up all at once behind her eyes, decades she had never once allowed herself to fully feel while she was busy, simply surviving. Rosa did not cry immediately. She sat very still, the way she always did when something mattered too much for an ordinary reaction to hold. Then, slowly, she told him her side of the story. The threats made against her when she was only 25 years old. The fear that had controlled every choice she made in those months. The impossible position she had been forced into by a man with far more power than she could ever hope to stand against. She told him about the cake, how the anonymous order had started arriving not long after the adoption was finally finalized, how she had always wondered in some quiet corner of her mind she rarely let herself visit, if it was some kind of message meant only for her, though she had never let herself hope too hard about what that message might actually mean. "I baked that cake every single year," she said, her voice finally breaking for the first time since he had walked into her life. "I never knew whose birthday it was for. I never let myself ask, because I was afraid of what it would mean if I ever actually found out the answer." Adam sat across from the mother he had spent his entire life believing had simply chosen a wealthy family over him, chosen an easier path without him in it, and understood for the very first time that she had chosen nothing at all. Everything had been taken from her, carefully, legally, and quietly, by the very same man who had raised him to believe the exact opposite story his whole life. The theft case still had to be resolved, regardless of everything Adam now knew about his own past, and he kept his focus sharp for Rosa's sake, refusing to let his personal discovery distract from the work still in front of him. He argued in front of the judge that the charges against Rosa were badly disproportionate to what had actually happened, that she was a woman with an otherwise spotless record for over 3 decades, trying only to save a small business that had served her community faithfully for years, and that the supplier pressing the charges had financial ties that raised serious and troubling questions about the true motivation behind such an aggressive prosecution over a used mixer and a few bags of flour. He did not reveal his personal connection to Rosa anywhere inside that courtroom. That was not the place for it, and both of them understood that without needing to discuss it. But something in the sheer intensity of his argument that day told anyone paying close attention that this particular case meant far more to him than a simple pro bono assignment he had reluctantly agreed to take. The prosecutor, a young man who had clearly been instructed by someone above him to push hard on the case, argued that the law should apply equally regardless of circumstance, that theft was theft no matter how sympathetic the story behind it. Adam countered by walking the judge through the ownership chain he had traced, layer by layer, showing that the very supplier demanding harsh punishment had unexplained financial motives for targeting Rosa's small business specifically, rather than treating the matter as the routine minor incident it would have been for anyone else. He did not need to name his father directly. He simply needed to show the pattern clearly enough that any reasonable judge would see it for what it was. Rosa sat quietly beside him throughout the hearing, her hands folded the same way they had been the very first day they met, her eyes fixed steadily on the judge rather than on the small crowd of onlookers who had gathered out of simple curiosity about a baker accused of stealing a mixer. When the judge finally spoke, her voice was measured and even, cutting straight through weeks of tension in a single sentence. The judge, after reviewing the full record and hearing Adam's argument, reduced the charges to a minor citation, effectively ending the matter for good. Rosa would keep her bakery. She would keep her name clear of any lasting record. It was, on paper, a small and unremarkable legal victory, the kind that would never make headlines anywhere. In truth, it was only the beginning of something far bigger than either of them had ever expected when the case first landed quietly on Adam's desk on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Adam confronted his father 2 weeks later, inside the same wood-paneled office where Richard had built his entire empire of quiet, careful control over 4 decades. He did not raise his voice, even once. He had learned a long time ago, standing in courtrooms and negotiating rooms, that the loudest person in any room is rarely the most powerful one. He placed the old adoption papers directly on his father's desk and said nothing at first, letting his father look down and slowly understand exactly what he was seeing spread out in front of him. Richard did not deny any of it. He seemed, in a strange and unexpected way, almost relieved, as if some old and heavy weight he had carried alone for over 3 decades had finally been set down in front of someone else to help carry it. He tried to explain himself, the pressure he had been under at the time, the fragile marriage he had been desperate to protect, the small mistakes that had slowly compounded over years until he no longer knew how to undo any of them without destroying everything he had built. Adam listened to all of it. Offering his father the same careful, patient listening, he offered every client and every witness who sat across from him. Then he told his father plainly and directly that none of it excused what had actually been done to Rosa, the threats made against a frightened young woman, the years of quiet sabotage against her small business, the decades of enforced silence that had cost her any real chance of knowing her own son while he was growing up. He told him that whatever guilt his father had privately carried and nursed all these years did not come close to balancing against the harm it had caused 2 people who never asked for any of it. Their relationship did not end in a single dramatic moment, the way it might in a story told for effect. It changed slowly instead, over the months that followed, the way most real and lasting things in life tend to change. Adam did not cut his father off completely, could not quite bring himself to do that after everything, but he pulled back noticeably, stopped attending the large family dinners that had once felt entirely automatic to him, and began quietly building something new instead, something honest, with Rosa. Eleanor Whitfield learned the truth not from her husband, but from Adam himself, in a quiet conversation over coffee that he had dreaded for weeks before finally working up the courage to have it. He owed her that much, he had decided, after everything. She had raised him with genuine love, had shown up for every school recital and every graduation, had never once, in 32 years, given him any reason to doubt that he was fully and completely her son. She was quiet for a long time after he finished speaking. Then she asked only one question, her voice steady despite everything. "Did you know all these years and never tell me?" Adam had to explain, gently, that this part of the story was not his father's silence toward her alone, but a much older silence that had started long before Eleanor ever held him as a baby for the first time. Slowly, carefully, Eleanor began to understand the shape of what her husband had actually done, not just to Rosa and to Adam, but to her as well, building an entire family on a foundation she had never been allowed to see clearly. She did not reach out to Rosa right away. It took her several months to decide what, if anything, she wanted to say to the woman whose child she had raised as her own without ever knowing the truth. When she finally did write a letter, it was short and careful, an acknowledgement rather than an apology, since she understood that the apology owed was not really hers to give. Rosa kept that letter in the drawer beneath the register, next to the old photograph, though she never told Adam she had written back. Adam started visiting Santa Fe often after that, at first for follow-up matters loosely connected to the case, and later simply because he genuinely wanted to be there. He learned to sit quietly in Rosa's small bakery in the early mornings before it opened to customers, watching her work the dough with the same careful, practiced hands that had shaped 32 separate birthday cakes for a son she never even knew she was allowed to love out loud. They did not rebuild 3 decades of lost time in a single conversation, no matter how much either of them might have wished that were possible. There was too much lost time for that. Too many years neither of them could ever fully explain or make up to the other. But they built something steady together, a little at a time, the same patient way Rosa had built her bakery from nothing, one careful and deliberate step after another. On his 33rd birthday, Adam flew to Santa Fe instead of staying in Los Angeles for the family dinner his mother had quietly stopped expecting him to attend. He walked into Rosa's shop early in the morning, well before any customers arrived, and found her already standing at the counter, flour dusted lightly across her hands, a fresh cake cooling nearby on a wire rack. Vanilla, 3 layers, no name written on top. "This one is not for a stranger anymore," she told him, her voice thick with everything neither of them could ever fully put into simple words. "This one is for you. I made it myself this time, knowing exactly who it was for, from the very first egg I cracked this morning." Adam sat down across the counter from her, inside the small, quiet bakery that had somehow held both of their lives inside it for 32 years, without either of them ever knowing it. He picked up a fork, cut carefully into the cake, and for the first time in his entire life understood exactly what it truly meant to be remembered. Outside, the town was just beginning to wake up. A delivery truck rolled slowly past the window. Somewhere down the street, a shop owner was unlocking a metal gate, the sound echoing faintly against the quiet morning air. Rosa moved around the counter and sat down across from her son, not as a stranger baking an order she never understood, but simply as his mother, sharing a cake she had finally been allowed to make with his name spoken out loud in her own heart while she worked. They talked for a long while that morning, about small things mostly, the kind of small things that families usually build up slowly over a lifetime of ordinary mornings. Favorite foods, old songs, the shape of an average Tuesday. It was not the dramatic reunion either of them might have once imagined in their private, unspoken hopes. It was quieter than that and steadier, the beginning of something built one honest conversation at a time, the same patient way Rosa had built everything else worth having in her life. Adam kept practicing law in Los Angeles, but he began taking more cases like Rosa's, cases where the system leaned unfairly on people who had no way to push back. And every time he won one, he thought of the moment he first understood what it meant to fight for someone who had been silenced for far too long. He visited Santa Fe often, and eventually kept a small apartment 2 streets over from the bakery, close enough to walk over in the early mornings before the ovens even finished heating. Richard never fully repaired what he had broken, and both he and Adam understood that some things, once broken in that particular way, simply could not be fully repaired, only carried differently going forward. But he did, in his own limited and imperfect way, begin trying. Small gesture by small gesture, year after year, the same slow, patient rhythm Rosa had once used to bake a cake for a son she was never allowed to claim. And every year after that, on the same day, a cake still arrived. Only now, there was a name written carefully on top, in Rosa's own steady handwriting, for the first time in 33 years.